afterwards. So that's just going to start in a moment. So great, yes. Welcome everyone to this afternoon's Centre for International Film Research at the University of Southampton Visiting Speakers Series. It's with very great pleasure indeed that I can welcome Dr. Davina Quinlivan from King's College London, which is where we both started out actually.
Yes.
Yeah. It's a particular pleasure, as I say, because Davina and I, possibly little known fact of film studies gossip, started our PhDs at the same time in the same place. So lovely to see you here. How far you've come, I should say. We started at KCL, and of course you're at KCL now too. So that's great. I've got the very disconcerting experience of a transcript being written out live in the comment box, which I didn't quite know how that started, but there we go. I shall try and ignore it and move swiftly on. So Davina is going to be talking to us today. She's going to speak for around about half an hour, and then wants to have as much discussion as possible. Unfortunately, her whole family has come down with COVID. So aside from the intrinsic benefits of an interactive performance, that's also part of the reason for doing it this way. Davina is an enormously prolific member of the film studies community. Her first monograph, Place of Breath in Cinema, came out, well, it's its 10-year anniversary, isn't it? I think that came out in 2012.
12, yeah.
Yeah, and then she went on pretty quickly after that to bring out Filming the Body in Crisis. She's also written a monograph on the cinema of Joanna Hogg, Female Expression in the New British Art Cinema. We are in the very early stages of co-editing a book together, although let's not jinx it with anything too definite, but watch this space for that. And as well as that, there's nothing going to stop her. She's actually also in the early stages of a short monograph for the Thinking Cinema series on the inner cinema of Deborah Levy. And if that all weren't enough, she's actually just written her first long-form piece of creative writing, Shalimar, described by Marina Warner as a writer of rare gentleness and insight. So truly multi-talented, and she'll be talking to us today about The Girl and the Honeybees, eco-critical perspectives on nature, memory, and the child's gaze in the spirit of the Beehive. Now, she assures me that this is going to tap into many of her interests, questions of vulnerability, of children, of the body, and how they all affect ideas of film theory. And I'll give the floor over to you. Just before Davina starts, obviously the usual points. Please keep your cameras and your microphones off unless you are actually talking. We're going to very much welcome discussion from everybody. As always, it's good to see people from the postgraduate community, colleagues, people from Southampton, people not from Southampton. So it'd be lovely if all of you can participate, put your questions, comments, and thoughts to Davina. You're free to do so in the chat box. So if you just click on the chat icon above, go for it. But you're also very much encouraged to switch your camera and microphone on and put your questions yourself. If you're too shy to do that, I'm also happy to. So anyway, Davina, thanks very much.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, Louis. Yes, of course, we've known each other for a very long time now. And it's lovely to be working with you again, as we've mentioned, on hopefully an edited collection of work together. And we've been, I think we first started teaching together in around about 2006 with Richard Dyer on a film forms course or something along those lines. So I'm very happy to be here today and to speak about Victor Erice's film, The Spirit of the Beehive. This is a work in progress. It's a book that's under contract, which is a contribution to the BFI Film Classics series, which is due out next year. So I'm currently working on it, and I'd like to talk about what the book represents. It's as for those of you who know the BFI Film Classics series, they're very intense, closely focused studies of one film in particular, usually with lots of images in them. We have this great a granting of the possibility of being able to have lots of images, lots of textual analysis, lots of theoretical focus, and very conceptually led. So my contribution is looking at this film in particular, which is an iconic classic film, which celebrates its 50th anniversary next year in 2023. I'm going to begin with a little bit of an overview of what the book represents and the reasons why I've chosen to look at certain aspects of the film and how I develop a critical analysis of the film in this way, in this fashion. So it's for those of you who are interested, the book is roughly around 25,000 words, so a little bit, quite a bit longer than an MA dissertation, for example, or a couple of chapters of a PhD. But for those of you who are MA students in particular, or PhD students, hopefully you'll find that interesting to see how I set up these particular questions or how I think about those things. So I'm going to begin by introducing some of those ideas, introducing the film. And then after that, I'm going to start to develop a little bit of a presentation on what is the third chapter of the book, which focuses on this idea of the child's gaze and nature and the female child at the center of the story, with a little presentation. Okay, so it's been almost 50 years since the release of Erice's film, but it remains a canonical masterpiece. If you haven't seen the film yet, please do. I think there's various ways and channels in which you can reach the film, and there's a Criterion release of the film as well, which is brilliant. So this project will be the first, which I say without feeling too daunted, will be the first to investigate the unique perspective Erice's film offers up to viewers on the mental health of the female child and the particular prism of trauma and imagination at the centre of the narrative. So my project draws on key discourses within contemporary Spanish film studies, especially the work of Tom Whitaker, Marsha Kinder, Sarah Wright, Sarah Thomas, Chris Perriam, Sally Faulkner. I'm indebted to all of these writers, as well as opening up vital new perspectives on the film's representation of childhood, imagination, trauma and gender, and its legacy within contemporary Spanish cinema and beyond. So on the one hand, I'm looking at the film through a very a narrow perspective, in a way, looking at these particular questions. I'm also thinking about how the life of the film continues, especially the image of Anna, the girl at the center of the film, and how her image as an archived image or as a spectral presence throughout cinema, throughout the idea of cinema viewing and the cinematic image, has continued to persist. Ostensibly, I'd just like to talk about the narrative of the film, set in Francoist Spain in 1940. The spirit of the Beehive tells the story of a child whose world is irrevocably changed when she meets a fugitive, a Republican soldier. And the film takes place after the war has been won by the Francoists. So, and it's very important that we think of the narrative in these terms. So 6-year-old Anna's obsession with the horror film Frankenstein, directed by James Whale in 1931, is beautifully evoked through Erice's use of cinematography and the framing of this moment as a very long sequence at the beginning of the film, where we watch Anna through a crowded makeshift cinema, traveling cinema, become enthralled by this movie, Whale's Frankenstein. So it beautifully evokes the naivety of childhood when when Anna refuses to accept the murder of its monster, whom she is fascinated by. So there's lots of questions about about magic, about imagination, about the psychic life of a child, the child's inner life, and then also that great sense of modernity, of threat, of trauma, of this very patriarchal world which is closing in around her, which is really very symbolic, and there's the metaphor at the center of that. Also, how we can read that specifically in relation to the child, or the female child. So this sense of innocence and this innocent perspective shapes Anna's discovery of the soldier. It affects the way in which she perceives the soldier and her relationship with something frightening and disturbing and strange. Unaware of the threat he poses to her, Anna's experience of the soldier is dangerously enmeshed in the memory of Wales film and his monster. Her perception of place, especially the pastoral landscape in which the fugitive is found, is also something which entirely draws me into this film. I started thinking about this film while I was writing The Place of Breath in Cinema. There's a lovely comment by Martine Bunier in her book Cinema and Sensation, where she talks about the idea of the sort of electrical storm and the sounds and the soundscape of this film, this very sort of elemental atmosphere that's very much at the core of this film viewing experience. And she writes about this film, and it really struck me as I was writing about Lucia Hadzi-Halilovich's film Innocence, as well as all the work collectively that I've been doing on films like Innocence and like Carol Morley's The Falling. And there's something that really affected me on that level of how I was contextualizing or rethinking this particular figuration of the child. And I've been writing about the child for a long while, since The Place of Breath in Cinema. But before I talk about any more of this, I just want to say a little bit more about what's been said so far. So Erice's style is widely associated with a kind of what Adrian Martin describes as a sense, memory, and poetry. And he developed a lovely installation for the BFI with Cristina Alvarez. And that's the quote, as you can see on my slide: "Cinema gets glued like a second skin to things." That's a quote which is brought up through that presentation. You can find the entire presentation on YouTube. I think it's about 13 minutes long. So for those of you who are interested, if you Google it, you can find it quite easily. So this film is highly celebrated and influential. It's probably one of the most important films ever made in Spain, and hopefully I won't be criticised too much for saying that, because I think this is a wide recognition and accepted fact. But I also want to think about a close reading of this film that has yet to be developed in this context. So my project not only re-examines Erice's film, but also draws attention to the vital ways in which its influence has reached far beyond its canonical status. Contemporary filmmakers such as Guillermo del Toro, especially his film Pan's Labyrinth, and Steven Spielberg have named Erice's film as a key influence, serving as a template for all those Spielberg children who bond with magical beings. Erice's film not only says something truly authentic about the imaginative powers of children, it conjures up a nuanced, complicated exploration of innocence and gender as we witness the film through Anna's subjective reality. Through cinematography, lighting, and sound, Erice permits viewers to see the world through the eyes of a young girl, using cinematic space in a highly distinctive way, in order to construct Anna's view of the world both as a familiar domain and as an ever-changing and volatile realm. Importantly, Erice's film also famously authenticates a form of symbolism in order to add layers of meaning to his narrative at a time when film censorship in Spain regulated representations of the Spanish Civil War and its aftermath. And I think that's one of the most well-known and acknowledged points of the film, its use of symbolism and how it was trying to avoid censorship in order to critique the regime. So I want to definitely acknowledge and assert those points in my work, but I also want to think about what else is at stake here, especially through recent developments in film studies and through a closer analysis of Anna's true power and her as an iconic image within the film. So I want to reread the film through a largely film philosophical framework. I would say my investment is in these particular concerns, highlighting the correlations between the psychoanalytic thought of thinkers such as Melanie Klein and Hannah Arendt. I've written about Melanie Klein and the child before in my second monograph, Filming the Body in Crisis. So it makes sense to me to be building on that particular interest and how it's continued to reshift and reconfigure through my work. So I want to think about reparation and trauma, as well as the issue of imagination and healing in cinema. This question of healing has been addressed by thinkers such as Sarah Cooper or Emily Hasty and Vicky LeBeau, to name a few. While the end of the film suggests that Anna is deeply traumatized and has retreated into a silent world through what has happened to her and through her discovery of the soldier and learning of his death and disappearance. I think there are still questions about that sense of cinema as a form of survival, how cinema is or functions as a cultural looking glass or an enabling way in which to perceive moments in history, but also how that has a sort of an effect on the way that we view the life of cinema now in our contemporary age. So I want to say a little bit about Anna's world and the idea of childhood before I do my very short PowerPoint presentation. So we'll move on to some other images for you to look at in a moment. As I've said, I'm going to be looking at some of the theoretical ideas which I've developed before through Filming the Body in Crisis and The Place of Breath in Cinema. Perhaps I should say now, it's not always so easy to build theoretical strands across several pieces of work, across a decade's work as a scholar, as an academic, and that's not something that comes very easily. But I think these ideas and the concerns I have, I think it's an ongoing investigation, and it's like picking up strands from areas which you haven't had the scope to develop on, to develop and to continue with. So I always think of the next work or the next thing I'm working on as simply be able to open up that door a little bit wider, or picking up that strand, because I knew I couldn't explore it at the time, but it was something that began or started to crystallize much earlier on, and sometimes it might take years before I get there. I started teaching Pan's Labyrinth, for example, quite regularly about 4 years ago, and so it feels like I've lived with Anna and her various incarnations through films like Pan's Labyrinth for a long time. Okay, so Anna's world. So I want to think about how we see through her perspective. How does that work? How does that work on a formal level? or on a theoretical level, how does that work through cinematography, through critical analysis, through the way that we think about framing or the use of light, also sound, because I'm very interested in sound and elemental sound, the sound of the wind, the Frankenstein character, or the idea of Frankenstein is supposed to be like a spirit, or Anna's sister responds when Anna says, well, I don't know why Frankenstein killed the little girl in the story and why he was killed. And she says, you shouldn't think about it like that, but he's a spirit. He's there for you to whisper to. And at the end of the film, we see her it's suggested that she's imagining this invisible spirit beside her. So that's that idea of not seeing as well as seeing, and imagination and the sounds attached to that is really important. So I also want to draw on the feminist work of Iris Marion Young, Throwing Like a Girl, the work of the female child in cinema from Fiona Handyside, Anna Bachman Rogers, with her work on Picnic at Hanging Rock, and then contributing to feminist film studies, the study of childhood and trauma studies, film philosophy, and Spanish film philosophy. So I want to think about how Anna's meeting with the soldier and her movement through the farm is contextualized or pictorially rendered, how the cinematography, famously, the cinematographer of this film was going blind. So not only do you have this sort of dusty atmosphere of Castilla, which is where it was filmed in rural Spain, but you also have these kind of depths of texture, or these kind of gauzy images. Again, the idea of seeing and not seeing, or sight. Wind, whispers, thunder, silence, sunlight, the glow of the beehives, electrical light, movement as well, obviously establishing the idea of modernity through there's this moment when this train passes, and you also see the train track, which is an iconic moment from the film. So all these elements invite us into Anna's physical or sensory world, as well as her emotional inner life. Okay, so we've moved on to the slides bits of me speaking. Okay. So historically, the child, as Emma Wilson writes in her book, Cinema's Missing Children, she looks at how historically the child, the female child in particular, is aligned with an angelic, innocent perspective. Children's faces as pictorial images, often objectified. And we see this through the history of Hollywood cinema in particular, but also in genre cinema and in mainstream cinema. There's also a fascination with the child that is mourned, or the missing figure, which Emma so beautifully writes about. The female child, again, I think is something which is such an emotive topic for me, and I've taught this idea for years. There's something about the female child at the center of this story. I think often there's much writing about Anna being a child, but I think there's something much more about the idea of thinking through a feminist perspective on this film, and this notion of innocence and female identity. Mary Cassatt's Little Girl in a Blue Armchair, and then Anna with her cat, the filming of Anna in this kind of very honeyed light in her bedroom with the cat, these moments which kind of render us lost in this childlike universe, the sensory, tactile imagery of the bed sheets, a bit like the armchair that's sort of enveloping the girl's body, and this exchange of looks between the dog and the little girl in the armchair, and then how that unfolds through Spirit of the Beehive with Anna and this animal life. And the animal life, not just the bees, which broadly represents the Francoist regime, or this idea of the bees fulfilling their duty, fulfilling this regime without the father writes about the beehives. He writes about how they're fulfilling their duty, they're doing all these things in a very ordered fashion, but there's no imagination, there's no individual thought, and so the beehive becomes synonymous with this idea of the diminishing of the individual, the extinguishing of the individual. But then you have this these moments with this cat within the film as well, which I want to look at a little bit more closely, and how we move through Anna's perspective, and how she isn't necessarily objectified or rendered as this innocent child, but there's something else being threaded through about her inner life and about the sense of innocence, which is much more complex or nuanced. I've got some images here, especially on the right, picnic at Hanging Rock, and then Tree of Life, Malik's Tree of Life, thinking about this use of light and the idea of painting with light, and this pastoral imagery, and moving away from this romantic notion of pastoral imagery, but how we think about the use of light, so material, like the actual light within a location, so the use of sunlight, the gauzy textures of light within the image, within the diegesis, within the film, the world of the film, but also how light is used by the cinematographer, and how I want to think about that in relation to the female child. There's a brilliant book by Catherine Vassilou called Textures of Light, Vision and Touch, I think, which looks at the work of Luce Irigaray, Merleau-Ponty and Levinas. And I first discovered that book while I was writing my PhD. And there was only one copy of it at Senate House Library, and I kept it for a little bit too long, and it was very expensive to buy, but I do have my own copy now, which is a beautiful exploration of the use of the thinking through of touch and light, not in cinema, but through thinking about Irigaray and Merleau-Ponty and different types of light. So like Plato thinks about light and sunlight as this representation of knowledge. So, you know, when you bring something to light, or how we equate light with knowledge. And then she talks about different types of light, like underground parking light, and what kind of light that could mean or represent. So this other type of light associated with a more industrial or modern world, and this the way that we think about vision, touch, and light. Going back to Hadzi Halilevich and innocence, I'm also going to be, as it were, reworking some of the ideas which began through my work on innocence, especially Sobchak's piece, it's called Waking Life. And she thinks about the phenomenology of Hadzi Halilovich's film. And I think it makes a lot of sense to me to bring Spirit of the Beehive into contact with a film like Innocence, as well as films like Picnic at Hanging Rock and The Falling. And that will be a moment where other readers or critics may shout, "No, don't do it!" But I definitely feel as though there's scope and huge potential to be thinking about Anna along this whole this genealogy of women within cinema, young girls within cinema, and how her life almost lives on through films such as these, and how that power and that potential of thinking through that figure of the child is still a very important motif or important configuration within film history. So on the one hand, thinking about the sensory, the phenomenological or the ecological aspects of the film, especially the way that we think about nature, with the work of Astrida Neamanis's work, Bodies of Water, Post-Human Feminist Phenomenology, and the way that we think about the way that we're starting to enter this new era where there's this development of an increasing development of eco-critical work. This brings me to these questions, which are eco-critical, and they're political, of course, through the very obvious nature of the film and its critique of Francoism, but also how that's done, how that's so resonant now, that's so rich and so resonant with regard to these eco-critical perspectives, which are looking much more closely at landscape, at nature, at the way that ecological disasters or climate change are being explored through experimental documentaries, through mainstream cinema, as well as art cinema and experimental cinema, and how these questions are starting to surface. So in another chapter of the book, I'll be looking at the way that nature is grounding some of these questions about Anna and Anna's perspective, which also leads on to work within the environmental humanities more generally. Speaking of the politics of the film as well, and going back to art history, I was reminded of Pelez's image of the violet cellar, and this depiction of this the child worker and the Industrial Revolution, and how we think about this, the history of art cinema and portraiture. And then going back to films such as The Wizard of Oz as well, which I think is another key film to mention in this context of thinking about imagination and fantasy, and then film, cinema, and politics, and how, of course, some readings or some treatments of The Wizard of Oz will look at those questions and look at the way that it portrays American sort of utopian ideas or ideologies around America at the time, and American identity and politics. And then, of course, Pan's Labyrinth, Mirene's Salon Bombay, which is filmed on the streets of Bombay, of course, mostly on the trains as well, and Pan's Labyrinth. I think one could almost write an entire book on the spirit of the Beehive and Pan's Labyrinth. But I want to sort of seal off or sort of close off some of those questions for now. But I think definitely through Ophelia, the central protagonist in Pan's Labyrinth, and the way magic realism and nature and innocence and trauma is woven through this film, certainly connects up with the spirit, as well, the spirit of the Beehive. Oh, okay. So finally, just to summarise, I've set up some of those points and hopefully explained my approach to the film. I haven't quite finished the book yet. So just to conclude, I'm really interested in your thoughts. I'm really interested to hear your thoughts if you've seen the film, if some of the things I've said have prompted you to think of new ideas about the film or new perspectives. In some ways, it feels as though I've been writing and teaching writing on this film and teaching this film for many years. And I think the main aim of the project, of the book, is to bring the film into our era, into the current age, and into the world of contemporary cinema, without undoing or underestimating all of those socio-historic critical analyses and all of those points about censorship and Francoism and its role within Spanish film history. I want to respect and to acknowledge all of those things, but I think it brings the most value when thought through in relation to these eco-critical discourses and a feminist film phenomenology, which for me now makes more sense, not only through the very little body of work that I've developed over these last few years, but through other writers and thinkers whose work has sort of has been weaving in and out of these questions for many years now. Okay, so Louis, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Great, thanks very much. So thank you very much, Davina, for that discussion of your work and of your thoughts and all of those associations that, as you see, lots of hands clapping there, in thanks for that. Yeah, all of those different associations from art history, from film history, that you bring to the film. So let me just finish the recording so people can chat in peace. Just 1 second. So I'm no good at multitasking. Right, there we go. Stop recording and transcribe.